So, Alex, you've just written a book. How's that been?
Well, it's been great. It was difficult to write it, as I'm sure any writer out there knows, but we are thrilled with how it's been received, and we're just glad to get it out there and spread the message of positive communication for leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I read it. I loved it. I think it's got a very unique style in the sense that there's stories, actionable steps, a lot of science and research that's gone into it as well. And I think very often books kind of capture one or two of those elements, very rarely three. So it's a really pleasurable, enjoyable, and practical read, for a young professional. So no, thank you for writing it. And I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of many others as well. You
Well, thank
wrote
you for your
your
compliments about that. We worked hard at actually exactly integrating those things into it. So I'm glad you noticed the combination of ways to support the ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. You wrote your first book in 2016, if I'm correct. What would you say is different about this one?
Well, the first book was a book of case studies, cautionary tales and success stories of a lot of name brand organizations. And I really loved using a case study approach because it appeals to people who like to then take those lessons and apply them. This book is quite different. And that was a little more on the academic side, more for like executive education. This book is different in that it's written for the average professional, the average up and comer emerging leader. So I think it appeals to everybody as opposed to a more isolated or select crowd. And that writing, you write a little differently when you're thinking about all the different people who might read it. You have to think about how to reach the average reader, and you can't, for example, bog it down with endless pages of research. It'll get boring. At some point, they need real life stories. They need to see how they can apply it to their lives. So that was a challenge to write it like that.
Interesting. And how has it been co-writing a book? That sounds like it's a lot of back and forth feedback. Is it as stressful as it sounds, or more fun?
It was actually a joy. So the co-author, yeah, we co-authored this. My good friend Julian Miravel and I. He's also a communication professor, and we've known each other for over 20 years. We were in grad school together. We shared an office back then. We had our first job together at the University of Arkansas Little Rock, and we've published research together before. So we work really well together. We're also very good friends. So it was really a joy to work on it. And Julian is such a great writer that it was every time I would read something, I would get inspired by it. And when we do speaking, we do speaking together, both of us for our clients. Sometimes I'm listening to him speak and I'm getting so caught up in his message. He's so good at it that I forget that I'm supposed to be there presenting too. I started listening to him. So it was a joy. I'll tell you, if you want to hear about how you co-write something, I don't know, I can't speak for everybody else, but we took a approach that took over 2 years, but it worked out great. Like people always ask, what do you like take one chapter and the other person takes the other chapter? But we wrote it essentially all together on a live document. We met once a week for about an hour or so. We just worked on it, and then we would have some homework assignments for the week, and work on our own a little bit on our parts, and then come back together and write down to the sentence. I mean, there are some sentences and stories that I know are his and I know are mine, but like write down to some of the stuff. I don't remember who came up with it. So we really took a team approach the whole way through, which was, I think, twice as hard, but twice as rewarding.
Hmm. Wow, that's awesome. Really getting lost in the process there. I've been
Yeah.
working on a little piece of my own. I started writing what was going to be like a free ebook kind of lead magnet for my YouTube channel. And very quickly it turned from like, a 10 bullet point ebook to something much bigger. And then I think it's currently sitting at like 25,000 words.
Wow.
And I've got to stop myself. It's getting out of control. But just like you say, writing is such a difficult process to start, but also to stop. So it's yeah, it's
Yeah.
refreshing to hear similar tales of co-writing. And I guess I'll have to find someone, or I might have to wait 20 years to co-write my next one. But that's nice.
Yeah. Writing is a dangerous process, isn't it? Like if you make a table of contents, like, oh, here are 10 things I want to talk about, then the project tends to take on a life of itself and starts to grow beyond what you thought. And then here you are. Now you're at 25,000 words. You're like, okay, what's going on here? Where am I going with this?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. I think the one phrase that really kind of cut straight to the heart of communication for me was from the section compliment to affect people's sense of self. And the quote was, our words and actions have consequences and ripple effects on other people's identities, which also reflect back on it. I think the reason this struck such a chord with me is the story about Tanesha really hit home. And I'd love to tell you in your own words why complimenting is such a fundamental part of communication.
Yeah, this is a great story. So Tanesha was someone that Julian knows, like my co-author, and that's where he heard that story. But obviously, I've experienced things like that myself, as I'm sure you have. So when we compliment the other person, it's not just that you're making them feel good, or that you should never compliment to get something back from the person. That's not really a sincere compliment if you're doing it to get. You compliment to give. It's a gift. And when we do that, it doesn't make them just feel good in the moment. If it's a real sincere, detailed, precise compliment, it can change the way the other person sees themselves permanently. And that there's a lot of power in that. And I think that positive feedback in professional settings, complimenting is a form of positive feedback. It's underused. It's like this easy way to encourage people and help them see themselves in a different light. It's so powerful. So I had a experience that happened to me over 25 years ago. I was working at a place for about a year, and I decided to go to graduate school. So there's this boss, a couple levels up. We'll call him Scott, top dog in the whole place. I only had interacted with him for a few minutes here or there in the year I worked there. But my immediate supervisor said, "Hey, Scott heard that you're leaving to go to grad school. He wants to see you in his office." And when the top dog calls you to the office, you can't help but get a little nervous. You're like, "Geez, I hope this goes all right." So when I went in, he was thanking me for working there, and it was all really positive. But then he said to me, there are some people who work here, and I've worked with over my career, who positively affect other people in the long run, and they make an impact over the years. And then there are other people who have that same impact in 5 minutes. And he said, "Alex, I think you're one of those 5-minute people." And I felt like, holy smoke, that is such a powerful compliment that literally for the past 25 years or more, I have been trying to live up to the compliment that he gave me that day. And I'm embarrassed to say that it took me years to realize that he was a 5-minute person, that I had only talked to him 5 minutes total in my whole life, but he had that kind of impact. So that's the level that I think that's the influence leaders can have with that killer, positive, sincere compliment can really shape the way people see themselves forever. It pays off forever. They may not realize they have those strengths, but the other people can see it in them, and it calls it out of them.
I love that. And especially the idea of, living up to compliments even years afterwards. I had an English teacher when I was in year 9 and 10, and the most lovely person. And honestly, it was, my English class had a very diverse range of abilities, and some people hated English, some people loved it. But in her class, everyone really, really seemed to just sink into the material, because she went around and, even if someone had only written a line, she'd compliment them and say how they hadn't even written a line last time, and now they're doing so well and they're answering questions. But you'd always see, the positive in people. And I remember she said to me on results day, when we got our grades back, that she really wanted me to pick English to study further, but I was kind of more of a maths person. But she said that, no matter what you do with your life, you're the kind of person that you're going to make the most of every day. And it was such a simple compliment, but even now, sometimes when I'm having a bad day or I've had a bad morning, I still try and have, a positive rest of the day just because of those few words. And
Right.
it really is powerful how, it takes so little, but it gives so much.
That's a great illustration. That's very powerful. Wonderful.
Let's talk about listening to transcend differences. I think it's something I'm actually guilty of not doing. slowly working on it. But I think as egoistic humans, it's really easy to like zone out when someone's speaking to us, to kind of assume that we know everything. And now more than ever with the internet, there's you can have an opinion about something, about the best workout plan, the best diet, the best political opinion, and that's obviously that's foolish. In fact, I think we've arguably got the most to learn and share from the people who have a different opinion than us. So what do you think are the best kind of mindsets or frameworks to transcending this self-centered way of thinking?
Well, I think curiosity and having a genuine interest in other people. Like you said, we have these barriers. There have probably always been listening barriers. I think as human beings, we tend to be self centered for probably some good reasons. But when we're talking to other people, that self centeredness can create a barrier. So they're talking about the other person's talking about what they're interested in, but we're already thinking about something else. We're off in another direction, and we're thinking about what we might say back to sound clever if we're in professional settings. And most people don't just commit to 100% listening and getting curious and really wondering about getting to know other people or what their perspective is and hearing them out. So I think the first thing that we can do is just 100% commit to listening. Just say, I'm just going to listen. I've done that. Go out to coffee with a friend or a professional friend of mine, or have a meeting and just say in my mind before the meeting, today I'm going to focus on listening. And if I get to share anything, I'll get to that later in the conversation or maybe the next conversation. But today I'm just going to be a good listener and give them that gift, give them that 100% attention. And I think that's the very first thing you can do. And then, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of this answer, when you ask the question, take a genuine interest to be like, you have to care. I think that there's like levels, right? We don't listen well. Then there's some fake listening that we try, like we learn some behaviors. And so okay, I'll make some eye contact. I'll nod a little bit, when they say things. But then I think the real level, the deep listening that we talk about is, sure, you're making eye contact and absolutely you're putting aside distractions, but you're really interested, sincerely interested in learning about what the person has to say, what they have to offer, getting to know them. And I think once you have a genuine curiosity, you naturally do a lot of the great listening behaviors because you're driven by that sincere mindset. And I think that's where the gold is. Like, you're doing it right now. You're just listening to me. And I think podcasters are great at this. They better be great at it, right? Because otherwise they're not going to be very good podcasters. They're good at asking questions, and then they're good at just listening, really listening. And I think that's where people thrive. Even if they've never taken a class or read an article on good listening skills, if they have that sincere, genuine interest in other people, I think you have to like other people and like to learn to be a great listener. So people, they can try to fake it, but I don't know about you. I've been caught fake listening, and it doesn't feel good when you're like, yeah, I was definitely not listening there. But the sincerity and then putting all those aside distractions, that'll help people listen real well.
I mean, it's the old adage that we have got one mouth and two ears for a reason. It's so simple, but it's a good one to keep coming back to when you find yourself distracted. And yeah, absolutely. I think I've had some great conversations in my local park. Actually, it's kind of a hot spot for old men walking their dogs, and sometimes I'm just sitting on a bench and I smile at an old man walking past, and naturally they just gravitate and start talking, and just standing there sometimes for 5-10 minutes at a time, hearing them talk about life before technology and how the world's so different now. It's really refreshing, and I can't think how much less valuable those conversations would be if I tried to interrupt and argue about no, but the modern day is better. There is technology, and I can't believe you lived before Snapchat and Instagram. And yeah, I love listening to old people, especially. I think listening to old people is a great test of your patience, because sometimes they have those long kind of suspenseful pauses, but there's so much wisdom in their words.
Let me share an example. So of exactly what you're saying. So there's a guy in my neighborhood, And when we walk our dogs, we see him. He's not a neighbor. He's a little couple of streets away, but we always walk by his house, and he says hello. And we've gotten to know him over the course of years, walking by, and we see him at the gym, and we've even had him over. So I'm listening to this guy one day, and he's a phenomenal listener himself. He's an excellent communicator, but over the course of the relationship, just by listening to him, it turns out that he's in his 80s now. He's written, I think, 8 or 9 books, including novels and academic books. He's a former professor. He used to consult with the CIA. He's an expert on American and Cuban international relations. And the guy is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. But if I had just been focused on myself and wanted to just, somehow promote myself in this day and age, I never would have learned any of that. So you just sit and listen, and the stuff they tell you, it's hard to believe. There's a lot of amazing people out there if you just have the patience to listen.
Yeah, I think this also goes back to the idea of the personal brand. I think I was having a conversation with my friend the other day, who's also a creator, and we were speaking about how the personal brand starts in real life. Like, it's so simple, but people imagine this personal brand as this online kind of object or platform.
Yeah.
But actually, it starts in person. And again, one of the best things you can do to boost your personal brand or just to be a better person in the world is to listen, because
Yeah.
as other people need conversations and that outlet just as much as we do. So no, I love that. I love that. Let's talk about vulnerability, the chapter that speaks about, I think it's disclosing to gain trust. I believe one of my favorite TED Talks is The Power of Vulnerability by Brené Brown. And it's always kind of fascinated me how much more I trust teachers, sports coaches, even parents when they're sharing stories about, their slip ups, their embarrassing moments. And it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because, we assume that we would, trust someone with authority or someone who's at things. But when someone shares those vulnerable moments, it really warms us to them. Why is it that there is such a strong correlation between vulnerability and trust?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons, but I think that if people only talk about their successes, I don't know that that's authentic. I mean, we all have difficult days, we all have setbacks and failures. And when you share some of your setbacks and failures, people can relate to that. It's like what they did in Marvel Comics a long time ago. They wanted to make superheroes with a flaw so that the readers could relate to them instead of the perfect superhero that can do anything. Like Superman was hard to relate to for a while. But in Marvel, they gave everybody a weakness so that then as the reader or now viewer, you can see yourself in them in some way. And I think you say, oh, she's a real person or he's a real person, just like me. And we can relate to that. And I don't think we trust people who always have only good news to say about themselves, because then you think it just feels like marketing. It feels like they're advertising something to us. You think, okay, but when am I going to, is there a real person in there? Can I connect with the real? I think we crave authenticity, but yeah, that means being vulnerable. And that is not something that a lot of people are comfortable with now. We all want it, we crave it, but doing it is hard. Sharing your failures is hard. But the people that I know in my personal life, in all areas who are the most successful, they'll talk all day about their failures, especially the ones in the past. They'll tell you, "Oh, you can't believe how much money I lost on that investment." They're not thrilled about it, but they can laugh about it now. They'll say, "Oh, I made every mistake you can imagine when I started." They love talking about their past missteps. And then we can, okay, everybody is on a journey. We're all works in progress. There's no such thing as perfection, at least in a professional setting. So I think we can just relate to them. We see they're more like us.
I think there's uh, a real interesting thing about the human condition where we're almost all stumbling around in the dark, and we have occasional moments where the flickers on, but most of the time we're just feeling our way around. And yeah, when
That's
people
right.
kind of put that into words, it's really endearing, I think. Curiosity is something else I've always really been fascinated by, and we kind of spoke about it a bit earlier. A quote I really like is judge a man by his questions, not by his answers. That's Voltaire. And when Kobe Bryant was interviewed about why he trained so hard 4 times a day from 4 a.m. till 11 p.m., he said that he was curious about how good he could really get. And lastly, Tim Ferriss, one of his most famous pieces is 17 Questions That Changed My Life, which is something I've got bookmarked and I keep coming back to. I think as children, we are naturally curious. We naturally have that desire to know more and learn more. Even in communication, there's the typical idea of the kid always asking why. Are we there yet? No. Why? Because it's far away. Why? We need to refill the petrol. Why? And although at that age it's annoying and maybe we overdo it a little bit, I think communication has a really important place in curiosity has a really important place in communication. So tell us about, where does someone start being more curious to ask better questions to employees, colleagues, children?
Well, I think that so questions are like the flip side of the coin to good listening. Questions will drive a conversation. And so I think the first step is just realizing that if you want to be good conversationalists, if you want to build relationships and get to know people, you have to ask some questions. A lot of people don't know that. You know that. I know that. I try to teach it, but maybe you've been in a situation where you've met someone and they might even answer your question, but they don't pitch a question back to you. They just kind of stand there. They don't know what to say after that. So for anyone watching or listening, you got to ask some questions in conversations to keep it going, to get to know people. That's the first tip. Just ask questions. As far as where does the curiosity come from, I think it circles back to what we were talking about. I think you have to actually care about people. You have to value the person past the role. I think sometimes in professional settings, we see the role or the job title, and we just talk to people as if they are a mere obstacle or resource for our purposes. But you have to wonder about the whole person and relate to the whole person. What's their life like? What is a day-to-day experience for them? What are their struggles? And I think that's really what it comes down to in terms of getting curious. You have to start internally wondering, I wonder what their life is like. I wonder how they got that job. I wonder where their career is going. And then vocalize, ask those questions. And the best questions are open-ended. We talk about this in the book a lot. And again, good conversationalists know this. If I ask you, how long you been in London, you might tell me, so let me just ask you, how long you been in living there?
About 15 years.
All right, so 15 years. You just answered that in like 3 seconds, right?
Yeah.
But if I say, so since it's been 15 years, if you had said my whole life, then I would have asked another follow-up. But since you said 15 years, if I would have asked a follow-up saying, what brought you to London? Tell me about that story. I'm sure that you could fill pages, right, with your early experiences. So getting curious. One of my favorite questions to ask is, I didn't invent it. John Maxwell acts like he invented it, but he didn't either. But I read it in his book. Is tell me your story. So Julian and I, my co-author, were out presenting, and the night before we presented, the client took us out to dinner, and there's 4 of us, and I just said to one of the clients, I just said, so tell me your story. And she said, what do you mean my story? I said, your whole life story. Like that was my opening, not the opening question, but that was where we got before the food got on the table. And she talked for about 10 minutes, and it was fascinating. She started with her family history that went back 400 years. She literally told me her whole life story. And we all went around the table and told her some version of our life story. And honestly, I feel like the 4 of us bonded in a way that we never would have had we just kept it at a surface level. But I had to look, she wasn't my client. Like the 2 people, they weren't the client at that moment. They were real human beings that we wanted to get to know and care about. And then you make a friend for life, when you approach things that way. And as a leader in a professional setting, if your leader talks to you like that, if your leader wants to actually get to know you and is willing to, as we mentioned earlier, disclose and have you get to know them, you're going to form a relationship. And then you'll do anything for that leader. You'll do anything for that follower. that cause because they know you, you know them, and there's a lot of trust there. So I think getting
Absolutely.
just again getting curious, asking good questions, and then taking the time to be patient and realize that you're not trying to get anything out of them. You're trying to build a relationship.
Yeah, I love that. And a lot of the kind of work that I do with, people that I coach and on my YouTube channel is related to storytelling. I think that again, humans learn and share best in stories, right? We've
Yeah.
always been storytellers from the moment we had tribes and any sense of language. So I think
Yeah.
that's a really beautiful question, and I'm going to use it. I'm gonna steal that question from you, who stole it from someone else. Uh,
I've stole from John Maxwell, but he, he didn't make it up. He just acts like he did.
there's a whole story behind the question itself. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I heard Alex Hormozy, who's pretty big on the internet right now, talk about how we are always one or two hard conversations away from the life we want. And I think a spin on that for questions is you're always one or two questions away from, a shallow to a deep conversation. It just takes one or
Yeah.
two good questions, and before you know it, you're in that bonding, vulnerable, human phase rather than
Yeah.
like a transactional conversation. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm curious who your favorite or most memorable leaders are. I know you shared one earlier, your manager Scott, or your leader Scott. Is that right?
Yeah. I changed his name for
Okay.
the book, but yeah, he was great. But I didn't know him that well. He was the top dog. I only met him for a few minutes of my whole time there. But I really like looking back on my early, some of my early supervisors.
Mm-hmm.
Like I worked at this pizza place, and we write about him in the book. His name is Mike. Unbelievable leader. We're just delivering pizza. Fantastic leader. Really was a role model who would never ask you to do anything that he wasn't willing to do himself. He was working just as hard or harder than everybody at all time. And he always said that if you don't give people your best as a leader, they're never going to give you their best. And they'll withhold it until you give them your best. And he really did. He was an inspirational person back then. It was one of my first jobs, not my first, but maybe I was still maybe 18, 19 when I got that job. And those early bosses, early coaches, early teachers, like you mentioned a teacher earlier, I think those are the people we end up having in our hearts for the long run because they shaped us at that early age. But I've had some other fantastic supervisors as well. Another guy we mentioned in the book, his name is Rob Ulmer. He's now a dean in Las Vegas at UNLV. He was an excellent mentor. That was his strength. He would really see something in you and bring it out in terms of writing and publishing and researching and teaching and having a vision for your career. He was fantastic, and we're still in touch today. We were just texting the other day, and even though we haven't worked together in 16 years, he's that kind of leader. He still stays in touch with everybody. And
Mm.
I was just recently the chair of my department, and my immediate dean was excellent. He was just an excellent. And in movies, deans, if you say, "Oh, the dean," that's usually like a villain. If it's a movie about college campus or something, but he was great. He was always listened, took notes every time we spoke, and wrote everything down we talked about, and really listened. So excellent listener. That was his big thing. Excellent listener. And you would bring him a solution, bring him a problem and a potential solution. His ideas would always be better, but he would really heard you out and made you feel listened to. That was his strength. So I've been very fortunate. I know there's a lot of bad supervisors out there, a lot of bad
Mm.
bosses and bad leaders, but I've been fortunate. I think it's like that old 80-20. I think 80% of them were fantastic. And there were just a few that maybe weren't quite ready for the role. But I've been really fortunate to have excellent leaders. And we put a lot of them in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just like you say, the best leaders definitely have a really kind of listening centered and action centered approach as well. They're willing
Mhm.
to do all the work, which they expect you to do. Like I say,
Yeah.
like you said, one of my badminton coaches, he is a coach in Wales, and he was a really good example of this. Every time we would arrive to training, he was already sweating. He had been training there
Yeah.
just before us, and it really set the tone
Oh
really
yeah.
nicely.
That's the tone, doesn't it? Where he's already worked up a sweat.
Yeah, and I mean you're kind of scared because it's like if that's what he's doing to himself, imagine what he's
Yeah.
going to do to us. But yeah, either way, it really is very inspirational when you can see someone, matching the effort. Because I think, again, I've seen your videos on management versus leadership, and
Mhm.
it tends to be, you're either the manager's pointing fingers and talking and telling, or it's showing. And I think showing is the best way of
Mhm.
leading, as we know.
Yeah.
Awesome. Let's talk about different uh, leadership styles and leaning into strengths. I think it's easy in the modern day to paint this caricature of what leadership and effective leading looks like. But an example that I have is my geography teacher from year 10 and year 11. His name is Mr. Kennedy, and he was very soft spoken, very quiet, and a lot of his kind of classes consisted of just him asking questions and letting us work for a while, coming around and talking to people individually. And as for you and me who specialize in kind of public speaking and the typical techniques of getting people to speak louder, clearer, hand gestures, all the rest of it, I think it's sometimes maybe alienates people who are more introverted or have a slightly different leadership style. So, kind of tell us in your words why it's so important to lean into your strengths as a leader rather than imitating what you think a good leader looks like.
Probably the most powerful ingredient that we each have is our unique personality. We're individuals. And that personality, if you can get that to shine through, that is going to be a distinguishing feature of your leadership, how you come across to others, and it's going to make people want to follow you. So, yes, on the one hand, it's true that good eye contact, a confident sounding voice, standing with good posture, using gestures, those are fundamentals. Those are fundamentals to good speaking. And it's not so much that authentic authentic people break those rules, but they have other ways to have the same level or even greater level of impact through their unique personality. We each have a temperament, and you can't really coach a speaker outside of the limits of that temperament very much. You can get them to do things a little more or a little less, but they're going to have a way that they speak that you have to work with. So I always try to, I do have these fundamentals, as I'm sure you do when you work with clients, but you also have to realize if they have a interesting personality, you might want to again lean into that, like you said. But if they have a, if you work with another speaker who's not like that, you can't try to make them copy. I think copying other speakers' styles always comes off as a little insincere. We have our role models, we have our mentors, we have the people who we aspire to be like. You and I could list 10 each of people that get us fired up and we're like, man, I wish I could be that good. But in the end, you'll never be that good because they already did it. You know, there's only one Anthony Robbins. You go out there and you start acting like you're Anthony Robbins, people are not going to buy it. You know, you go
Mm.
out there and you act like you're John Maxwell, people aren't going to buy it. Sure, you can at first and be inspired and learn and imitate a little at first when you're beginning, but you have to find your own voice. And I think our own voice, our own personality, our own uniqueness, that's the best of what we have to offer. And if that's a little on the soft spoken side, fine. Now, if we're soft spoken out of fear, that's a different conversation. But if someone just has a gentle spirit, you got to work with their gentle spirit, right? You can't try to coach that out of them because that's what makes them awesome. That's going to
Mm.
make them reach people that other speakers can't reach. And I think that's the magic.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. As we draw to the kind of end of this conversation, let's kind of rewind back to the basics of communicating better. Hopefully, people have listened. If someone's listened this far into the episode, you're hopefully thinking this is cool. I'm liking what these guys are talking about. But when there's all this information and all these frameworks, it's sometimes hard to apply it actionably. So, what kind of action steps do you have? And I'm going to throw another ingredient in here, especially for people who work virtually. What can people do who want to apply these principles, who work from home or from a WeWork or something like that?
Yeah, that's the question of the day. everything we've talked about so far really focuses on face to face in terms of the examples we're using and how we think about this. Face to face communication is and always will be the standard that we measure everything else against. Technologies have come a long way, though, and they do allow us to catch up a little bit. So when we're talking about a online relationship, work relationship, or at least a hybrid work relationship, you have to overcompensate and
Mhm.
take the extra time and effort to make those connections. So a lot of times on a Zoom call, in an in-person call, we'll let's say in-person meeting, we'll sit around the table and we'll talk a little bit about how things are going and how your weekend was. We might even have an icebreaker, but a lot of times in Zoom calls, we get right to it and people arrive at slightly different times and we end up like recapping what's already happened a couple times before we really get to the meat of the meeting. And I think that as a leader, you have to be deliberate and say, to yourself and put it on the agenda. The first 5 minutes, we're checking in with people. We're seeing how everyone's doing. We might do a meaningful, deliberate icebreaker to check in and see how people are doing. When you are an email, you have to spend a little extra time opening that email instead of saying, when are you going to have the report finished? Open it, open the meeting with, hey, how's it going? How was your weekend? Take those extra moments to work on the relational side of the communication, even though you're virtual, and then get to the informational side of the communication. You have to almost favor the relational side because it'll just disappear. But one of the things we know from the research is that it takes more time to do that online and it takes more words. We don't have facial expressions unless we're like this. We don't have tone. And so you have to substitute more words for what we're missing in terms of our nonverbal cues and that immediacy that you get when you're in person. So it just takes extra effort day to day. Like it's now, if you're online and you're working with other people, consider connecting as part of your job description. It's not just your task. It's connecting is now part of your online job description. You have to do it.
I agree. And I currently work for a tech company who I've been working for 2 years, and this is my first job straight out of school. And I actually remember when I joined, it was pretty much at the height of the pandemic. And for the first 5 months, we didn't have a single office day. All the offices were shut and locked down. And
Right.
we got to know each other really well, me and the other kind of apprentices who I'm working with. But it wasn't until that first day that we met in person, and it felt like how much we knew each other had doubled. 5 months
Right.
versus 5 hours of working together.
Right.
And it was really interesting because even something as simple as how tall someone is, or
Yeah.
I've met you in person, you're like 6'4". This is scary. I thought you
Yeah.
were like a tiny person.
Right.
It's really interesting to take that dynamic offline to online, and I think that's probably the most caricatured example, because usually, again, it's kind of a hybrid relationship. You might have met a friend and then they move to a different country, but you still have a kind of memory of what they're like in person. But it was a really interesting kind of experience for me.
Yeah. I've had very similar things. You meet someone in person and you go, oh, like now it's a real relationship. You shook hands, you made contact, you might even have hugged or something. And you're like, oh, it's official now. We are officially working together, or officially we're friends now. There's no 100% replacement for it, but we can put extra effort in to make our best effort to bridge that relationship gap using the technologies that we do have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, since I realized how much it was hindering kind of getting to know people, I've tried to put in even just short meetings, like a 10-minute meeting in someone's calendar,
Yep.
just to intentionally to be casual. Because as soon as I see like a 30-minute, like, I think that people will get really scared because, oh my God, half an hour of my time. I think
Yeah.
it's respectful to put those quick meetings in. But yeah, no, this has been an awesome conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and
Yeah.
hopefully the audience has as well.
This is great. I can't believe we're at work right now. This is a work conversation for us. And
Yeah, it
see?
is. It really is. Yeah, yeah. But I mean, they say that when you find what you love, work feels like play, and this definitely feels like a
Exactly.
form of play. So before we kind
Exactly.
of wrap this up, where can people find your book and your other online content, or where can they kind of apply to work with you?
So they can find the book on Amazon. It's Positive Communication for Leaders. And they can find me on LinkedIn, Alex Lyon. Might be under Alexander Lyon. Can't remember. You can try either one. And I have a YouTube channel called Communication Coach Alexander Lyon. So those are the three places.
Awesome. And all of those links will be down in the pinned comments and the description as well.
Awesome.
Awesome. No, thank you for the conversation. And for everyone watching at home, make progress, make memories, be lucky.